Hey guys, welcome to Doctrinal Truths and the second episode covering a real world history of the Book of Mormon. First off, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who has given me feedback thus far. I'm still relatively new at content creation and I really appreciate any advice that you guys have. If you have any more insights or input, please just put it in the comment section below and I greatly appreciate it. Today we will be going over some considerations that one must make regarding the translation of the Book of Mormon, as well as covering a brief period of very early Nephite history. And with that being said, let's get started. So before we go into the various real-world site histories and travel routes of the Book of Mormon people, it's important to first go over what the Book of Mormon says and what it doesn't, whether that be directly or indirectly. Keep in mind that much of what I'm going to say has already kind of been put forth out there by several Book of Mormon scholars. I will leave a link to some of their work in the description, and I'll include it as a final slide. So first, we shouldn't expect to find any hard proof of the Book of Mormon, only evidences that continue to favor the Book of Mormon over time. This is something that was brought up by several of my viewers from the previous episode that I thought should be mentioned. Um, Proof is very difficult to find in the archaeological record, and we are often left to our own interpretation of how things existed in the past. So, for example, while the chances that we find a piece of pottery saying maybe Nephi was here are extremely low, we should expect to find other indirect evidences supporting the Book of Mormon, and this can include anything from the movement of peoples at the right general time period, uh, correspondences between geographic features in the text and the real world, and the existence of more verifiable archaeological evidences such as writing, warfare, geological events, large cities, etc. So it's a combination of all these factors really that add up to make a strong case for the Book of Mormon that leave it in a position where it frankly should be and must be considered and taken seriously. And as you can see here, some of the some examples of the things I was talking about, volcanic eruptions, those are easy to verify. The general time period of civilizations, those are generally easy to verify, and the movement of peoples, as we can see here. I explained this map in more detail in my last episode that you guys can go watch, and large cities as well. So second, the Book of Mormon is a translated text, and this means that we should expect to find anachronisms and ones that likely come from the mind of an early 19th century farm boy, Joseph Smith, obviously, who was the one that translated the book. Despite the Book of Mormon being translated by the gift and power of God, as Joseph Smith puts it, and several sources explaining the general translation process, we don't exactly know how it was translated specifically. We know that the Lord uses fallible minds of human beings to accomplish His means. This obviously included Joseph Smith, as well as the scribes and prophets in charge of protecting and translating the Book of Mormon throughout its history. So, something that is important to note here, the title page of the Book of Mormon itself, written by Mormon, one of the keepers of the plates, says about the book, quote, "And now if there are any faults, they are the mistakes of men. Wherefore condemn not the things of God, that ye may be found spotless at the judgment seat of Christ." So essentially this means that anachronisms will inevitably exist in this ancient translated document. In the Bible, we can see several examples of this, such as the mention of candles, despite candles not having existed during biblical times. Although whatever it was its use was probably similar enough to a candle that's what its later translators interpreted as. In the Book of Mormon, we can apply a similar logic. For example, a horse may not actually have been a horse. Curiously, their main context in the book is being used as food, as sustenance, which isn't something that would be considered normal to Joseph Smith, a 19th century individual. Metals may also have been an interpretation of other precious things used by Book of Mormon peoples, which were otherwise unfamiliar to Joseph. Swords may have been some sort of cutting weapon, different from what we normally consider as a sword. It's not that words don't have meaning, rather, we should expect to see Joseph Smith's 19th century conceptions of the world make their way into the text by means of translation. I think it's only fair that if we give leniency to other translated historical documents, it's only fair we do so with this one as well. So, for example, we have some examples here um, of possible anachronisms. Obviously, the Book of Mormon mentions goats. In Mesoamerica, we have an animal that looks very, very similar to a goat. It's called the red brocket deer. It's got the horns. It's got a similar body shape. Uh, so the correspondence, the correlations between the two are pretty obvious. We also have the mention of swords. Obviously, our modern conception of swords includes the classic hilt with the metal blade extending out, but in ancient Mesoamerica, that's not what a sword was. In fact, they had what we now know as makowites, which are these cutting weapons on the right. Sources indicate that by the Spanish indicate that they were extremely sharp and just as effective at cutting as their old world swords. Third, while travel times mentioned in the Book of Mormon are essential to establishing the general locations of specific cities and places, it's important to understand that they are different depending on who is traveling and where. So, for example, the average travel time for a large group of men, women, and children in the wilderness, such as those involved in the flight of Alma and his people to the land of Zarahemla from the land of Nephi, we really shouldn't expect a travel time of any more than 9 to 14 miles per day, max. And that's how we end up with that 21-day travel time, or about 210 miles between the land of Nephi and the land of Zarahemla that I brought up in last episode. However, military expeditions under forced marches / chases could often travel up to 30 to 40 miles per day, depending on the terrain and whether or not they were chasing or being chased. This is something that we often see with ancient armies such as the Romans. They were often forced to do marches up to 30 miles per day. We see this during Captain Moroni's Blitz campaign against the Lamanites on the East Coast as he chases them from city to city on relatively even ground over the course of 1 or 2 days. So here we've got a map done by scholars and archaeologists which have mathematically calculated the least cost paths between archaeological sites in Chiapas, or where we place the land of Zarahemla. Essentially, these cover the routes that would take the least amount of effort between each site. I'll cite the source that I used for this in the final slide, but this is just so that you guys can kind of get an idea. Basically, each of these lines in between these sites, these green dots, represent the easiest path it would take to get between them. And these are the paths that ancient Americans living in this area likely would have used. Fourth, people already existed on the continent for thousands of years by the time Book of Mormon peoples arrived here. This is something that was kind of misconceptualized early on in church history, but it's actually indirectly evidenced in several portions of the Book of Mormon text. So, for example, the prophet Jacob in Jacob chapter 2 gives a scathing rebuke of polygamous practices that were starting to take hold among the Nephites in the land of Nephi, which is interesting considering there were only a small group of people who followed Nephi into the land of Nephi after they separated from the rest of his family once landing in the New World. Polygamy would not have been a problem had only him and his family been the only ones in the New World at this time. In Jacob chapter 7, a man named Sherem shows up among the Nephites to convince them that there is no Christ. But the only logical place he could have possibly come from is from a group of people outside the Nephites that were already living in the area. Additionally, within several decades, the Nephites and Lamanites are engaged in regular warfare with increasingly large populations. The Lamanites are already said to be much more numerous than the Nephites, which is interesting considering, as I said earlier, Nephi took a large number of the original travelers from the Old World with him once he separated from his brothers, Laman and Lemuel. So, in that case, where did the Lamanites get the majority of their population from? Well, it could really only have been from peoples who were already here before Nephi and his family ever showed up. So, given this fact, a couple of things need to be noted. First, the integration of a small group of Old World peoples into the much larger Old World population would have forced them to adapt to New World customs. We should not expect to find much, if any, Old World practices or material in the archaeological record, as they would have been quickly replaced by New World methods. And DNA would have also been lost through genetic drift and bottlenecking. Essentially, if you've got a small group of people adapting to a much larger and integrating with a much larger group of people, you shouldn't expect to see much of a trace of them specifically. Second, the Book of Mormon makes clear that anyone who wasn't a Nephite was a Lamanite. So smaller subgroups are mentioned throughout the text, but they are all considered by the Nephites to be part of the larger Lamanite population. And lastly, Book of Mormon civilizations would not have been completely distinct from the civilizations we see in the archaeological record. Especially if you've got a small group of people, they likely would have integrated and participated in the cultural and material norms of the larger group at the time, to a certain extent, rather. So to paraphrase Book of Mormon scholar Brant Gardner, we shouldn't be able to tell the difference between a Nephite pot and a Mayan pot any more than we can tell the difference between a, say, Mormon pot and a non-Mormon pot today. If archaeologists were to dig up our civilization 600 years from now, it's not like they would be able to tell the difference between a utensil used by a Mormon family or a Jewish family any different than a utensil of, say, some other group of people that lived within the U.S. at the time. So with all that being said, let's dive into a more in-depth look at the Book of Mormon and its history starting in 2nd Nephi. So here's a map of general travels in the land of Nephi that I created for reference for you guys. We'll cover the specifics in future episodes. We'll cover the history of some of these sites and how they correlate and can or possibly correlate to various locations in the Book of Mormon. But for now, we're just going to be covering very early Nephite history once they land in the New World. So it's said that after Nephi lands on the west coast, probably somewhere a little bit south of here, this is southern Guatemala area. Down here would have been El Salvador. And Nephi and his family could have landed anywhere in that general area. But after they land, he takes his family and followers, or those who choose to follow him, and he takes them and they travel for many days before planting their tents in a new settlement they call Nephi. So they likely would have started down here, traveled along the coast, up into the mountains, and landed in this area and called it Nephi. As discussed in the last episode, this location was likely in a highland valley, as it was higher in elevation than the land of Zarahemla, but it also had to be traveled down to from the surrounding hills. The area that geographically fits this location best, and archaeologically, is today known as the Valley of Guatemala. So around the time of Nephi onward, this was the location of one of the most dominant cities in Mesoamerica, known as Kaminaljuyu. Early in its history, Kaminaljuyu was a chiefdom that likely composed of various communities made up of different ideologies and belief systems. Likely settling in its environs, Nephi and his followers probably saw this as an opportunity to settle and leverage relations with its peoples and partially gain access to their resources. This also probably explains how Nephi and his people were able to become so successful so quickly with apparent access to precious resources, as is stated in the text. As time went on, this chiefdom became a massive Mayan city-state and encompassed most of the valley, and its influence dominated pretty much this entire southern Mesoamerican area for hundreds of miles. It's interesting to note that within several decades of establishing their settlement, the Nephites are already experiencing outside pressure from the Lamanites. If we're to understand the history of Kaminaljuyu correctly, This was probably due to its growing influence that eventually absorbed the original Nephite community within the valley. So we're not saying that the original city established by, or town established by Nephi and his followers was Kaminaljuyu. We're just simply saying that it was established in its environment, which makes sense archaeologically as the city itself around the time of Nephi consisted of various neighborhoods and cultural practices and peoples. So early Nephite scribes consistently make note of having to fend off constant attacks and intrusions from the surrounding Lamanites. And eventually between 279 and 200 BC, this pressure becomes too much for them and they have to leave for the land of Zarahemla with Mosiah I. Other groups also continue to flee Zarahemla over the course of the following decades. So how does all of this correspond with Kaminaljuyu archaeologically? Well, the period of time in which the Nephites would have lived in the Valley of Guatemala alongside Kaminaljuyu dates to what is archaeologically known as the Late Las Charcas phase. So this phase encompassed from around 600 BC to 350 to 200 BC. And interestingly, when this phase was first analyzed, it originally dated several hundred years earlier. Sorenson, however, in his Mormon's Codex, asserted that the dating was actually wrong. And should be moved forward several hundred years, which would align more closely with early Nephite history. And almost like clockwork, recent radiocarbon dates analyzed by archaeologists Inomata and others have moved this phase forward by about 300 years, matching it almost perfectly with what we know of early Nephite history. The beginning of this phase is characterized by the appearance of incense burners, similar to those found in the Middle East, pottery pieces resembling various ethnic groups, and an increase in tower or pyramid construction. It's important to note that when the Book of Mormon mentions towers, it's likely referring to pyramids, given the fact that it was located in a Mesoamerican setting. So by the end of this phase, around 350 to 200 BC, archaeologists have deemed what was called a middle preclassic collapse. Although we'll be covering this in greater detail in the next episode, it explains why Mosiah I and his followers fled to Zarahemla around 279 to 200 BC. They, along with the rest of the Valley of Guatemala, were likely experiencing some kind of cultural collapse for one reason or another. It should also be important to note that the Central Chiapas Depression, which I showed in an earlier slide, equates with the land of Zarahemla, or at least part of it, begins to see an increase in pottery and vessels similar to that of Highland Guatemala, indicating an influx of immigrant groups entering the region. While dates given by archaeologists often aren't specific, what we do know is that the site history of Kaminaljuyu and the Valley of Guatemala match up very well with what is written in the Book of Mormon. And so here's a map of the Valley of Guatemala. This is found in John Sorenson's Mormon's Codex. It shows some more geographic details surrounding the area. I personally would place Shiloh down here, probably a little bit more to the north, and Shemlon probably farther towards the south, near the coast. But it's just for reference, and it kind of gives a good idea of the mountainous valley the city of Nephi found itself in. So that concludes this presentation. Thank you guys so much for sticking around to the end. I know it's a lot of information. I know this episode is a little bit shorter, but we will be covering much of the information that was touched upon and maps that were touched upon in this presentation more in depth later on in future episodes, so you definitely don't want to miss that. I plan on covering the later portions of Nephite history and the land of Nephi in the next episode. But please subscribe, please like, please share with your friends so that you guys don't miss the upcoming episodes that I have planned for you. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you soon.